host, Kaitan Afima Davis, and welcome to another episode of The Lens. It's really been a long time, my listeners. Well, tonight is really going to be an interesting conversation because a topic we are going to dive into is going to be really a deep topic. Yeah, so throughout history, humanity has risen on the backs of civilization. Cities built from dust, laws carved into stone, stories whispered into eternity, but beneath the marble and gold, who really built the world? We really want to know who gave their blood, their minds, their souls, so that people could live a better and dream a little bigger. Well, today, we work with 6 major civilizations, which is Sumer, or what you can pronounce as Sama, what you can pronounce as anything you want to pronounce it, which is present-day Mesopotamia. Well, a brief introduction on Sumer. If you really want to know who Abraham was, if you go to your Bible, that's where he came from when God called him to go to the promised land. So that's where he came from, the Sumer. Then we have Egypt. Everyone knows Egypt. We have Greece, Rome, Axum, and China. So, well, today we are going to ask ourselves 3 questions. Just 3. And they require us to dig deep now into history books, but into the human spirit. Well, let's go to the first question. Why did each of these civilizations believe was worth dying for? As in, there was that one thing that pushed them, and they knew that when they die for that something, it's really going to affect their future in generations and generations to come. Let's say, for instance, they believed in a divine order whereby kings were shepherds of faith. These guys saw kings as let me say, they saw them as gods. They saw them as maybe let me call them saints, because they believed that kings had the power to determine their fate. You know what I'm saying? Because they control the army, they control the economies, they control the food, they control the trade, they control the routes, everything. So the people in those days in Sumer saw the kings as gods, and they saw them as divine rulers. Well, this guy called Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh's tale is not one of conquest, but a man facing death itself. This was one. It's more of a legend. Let me say, I'm not sure if he existed though, but it's a legend. Gilgamesh, his fate whereby his poem says that he, as a king, was supposed to die for his own empire, to die for his own civilization, to die for his own people. So he was one in a million kings that decided to fight for his kingdom, really, which is worth dying for. And the thing about the Sumerians was they introduced the first script. Let me call it the first Bible or the first scripture. It's not a Bible in this case, but it's a holy book for their God. So these guys really introduced the first scripture, and this inspired the writings of many other books like the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, the Talmud, all that stuff. So credit goes to the Sumerians, and I think they introduced what they call the tall tower buildings called like the ziggurats. These ziggurats, whereby these were used as for protection, and they were used as forts to fight against their enemies, and to also they were known as maybe let us call them forts or barracks of the army in those days, and it just kind of evolves a really beautiful building structure in those days. So the Sumerians were really great inventors. Someone who introduced the first script called you know what I'm saying, and they also believed in the future. So they really believed that was worth dying for. Then let's dive deep into the Egyptians. Who were the Egyptians? And then I'll come back and explain to you more about the Egyptians. Well, welcome back from that short break. So, let me tell you about the Egyptian civilization. This was the first African civilization we had here in our continent, and it really contributed a lot. Number one thing that's going to be to build the pyramids. Nobody up to now knows who built those pyramids. It also introduced the mummification of bodies. It also introduced the afterlife, a topic that really affects all our religions in this world. We all believe that when we die, the some place we are going to go, heaven, hell, Jannah, whatever. but we believe that there's that one place, special place that we shall go after we die, and it depends on what good, on what deeds you did on earth, on how your life really impacted the people you lived with on earth. So that was the Egyptian theory of the afterlife. So one of the engineers of this theory was a philosopher called he was called like Imhotep. So Imhotep was the mind behind the construction of the pyramids. His calculations, well, we're not really sure, but history says he really he was the mind behind the engineering of the pyramids. So, and he built the first pyramid. This was the guy who was a commoner and rose to be a priest and later on an architect. And secondly, besides the gods they believed in, the Egyptians also believed that the pharaoh was divine and God on earth. I mean, this was someone who was in charge of your life back in the day. This was a person who was in charge of how you're going to eat, on how you're going to sleep, on how you're going to, on how you're going to live peacefully in this country. If you decide that you live a bad life, then I promise you, you're going to live a bad life. But if you said you're going to be at peace in this country, no matter what threats you go from, maybe let's say the mafias and what, you're really at peace. You had all this protection. But what was really common, what made these Egyptians unique and what made them special from other civilizations? These guys used engineering and mathematics to build like immortal pyramids. For instance, out now we ask ourselves what knowledge was used behind the pyramids, what knowledge was used behind the construction of all these beautiful structures, the pharaoh's palaces. They really used the mathematical procedures, and this philosopher called Imhotep was behind all of this. Not only did Imhotep introduced or was a priest, but he was also a doctor, a local doctor, traditional healer, because he introduced all kinds of medicines, and that really made his people respect him, and that increased his rate of respect in the country. Then there was one thing that also happened. There was one rebel, or there was one thing that changed the fate of the world. This was a prince, and later on became a pharaoh. He was called Akhenaten. I know you're asking yourself, why would a pharaoh rebel against his own country? Why would he follow? Why would he disrespect the traditions that his ancestors had passed down? This guy replaced all gods with one sun god called Aten, and this gave the birth of monotheism. Monotheism is the worship of one god, and they believe in one deity. So this his idea led the birth of Judaism, which led the birth of Christianity, which led the birth of Islam. The reason I'm saying it led to the birth of Judaism was formed when the Israelites were in Egypt. You know what I'm saying? Judaism is built on the foundations of Moses. I know, asking yourself, I think Abraham is the ancestor of all of them. I think no. Abraham was a spiritual man. He was not a Judaist. Judaist means the name Judaism is derived from Judah. Judah was the son of Jacob. So literally, Judah was the great grandson of Abraham. So Abraham wasn't a Judaist. So why I'm saying this, why they call them Judaists, was that Judah at a point in time became the ruling tribe in Israel. So that's hence the name Judah. But the religion, as in the religion, was formed by Moses. Maybe the Israelites there might have seen this sun god. I'm not saying God is not, but he is really real. But maybe they might have believed that the God who saved them from Egypt is the same God Akhenaten formed. Yeah, that's really going to be a disturbing topic, but let me cut it down. In short, when God appeared to Moses, he told him to go and let his people free, right? Then, boom, in Egypt you have this god called Aten. And it is said that in Egypt, the followers of Akhenaten were one of the richest nobles in Egypt, were the richest priests. These were the richest men in Egypt. So maybe the Jews had the feeling that maybe this God that appeared to Moses might be the same God that appeared to this Pharaoh, and hence they followed Moses. A point in time was this guy faced massive resistance from priests and officials. He sacrificed power to pursue spiritual purity. It's like a quote from the priest who asked him, "Do you think one God will solve all your problems?" I mean, in Egypt, every god had his own deity. They had their roles, and they had what they would charge. All the gods had what kept them as gods. For example, we had the gods of fertility, we had the gods of war, we had the gods. So each god was assigned to his own responsibility. But then this Pharaoh wakes up one morning and he's like, "Ew, let me introduce this Akhenaten. But this idea, his philosophy of monotheism, later inspired the formation of these other religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Let's again go out a short break and we shall come back and talk about ancient Greece and explain a little view of it. Also say about the ancient Greeks, where we all know that these guys, beyond their wisdom, despite all the other civilizations we've heard of, the Greeks were not more into kingdom stuff. Yes, part of the Greeks were part into the conquering stuff, but the reason was they were trying to defend themselves from the enemies. Like a point in time where the Spartans in Sparta, but then the Greeks, their culture mostly emphasized on learning new ideas and new reasons of life. A point in time was this culture led the birth of famous philosophers like Socrates. Socrates believed in questioning. He believed that why does this happen and when, at what right point in time should this happen? So due to this, let's say, corruption, to these atrocities in those civilized areas, Socrates had to question everything. So that's where their culture comes from. So what really made it unique? As I said earlier, it was the birthplace of reason and questioning. Like, you have to question everything that's taking place around you. And surprisingly, that's where the first experiment with democracy took place. It took place in the city of Athens. A democracy was whereby the government of the people, for the people, and by the people. So this act or this experiment was what gave birth to what mostly, I think 70% of today's governments are democratic, which are 30% are still monarchic, or let's say like unitary governments, you know what I'm saying? So that's how, but we all know the Greeks really contributed to this birth of democracy. 70%, for instance, our country in Uganda is a democratic country, and it also laid the groundwork for Western philosophy and ethics. Why I'm saying Western philosophy and ethics right now, and it was the Greeks that gave birth to the habits that present-day Europeans use, to the ethics that they use, to the way they eat food, the way they pray, the way they dress, the way they handle their way of life. And this European way of handling life was passed down onto us through the act of colonization. So that's why I'm saying, laid the groundwork for Western philosophy. We all believe, for example, the Europeans believe in one woman, one man, which is monogamy, but in the African aspect of life, we believe in one man and multiple women. But then it was the Greeks that introduced this stuff from monogamy, Western philosophy, and so on and so on. And who really sacrificed for it? Like, who really gave up his life? Socrates, the first great philosopher in Greece. He asked dangerous questions about justice, truth, and the soul. This was the man who even sacrificed his own life by drinking hemlock rather than silencing his truth. For example, he would ask you, like, why does the government have to steal money for the people? You know? And his philosophies and his beliefs really gave birth to revolutions, and even democracy was part of it. Because people reach a time where they're like, let the people now choose who they want to be governed by, not a matter of an order whereby you're born and then you find this is your king and then one family keeps on ruling, you know. There was also this king of Sparta. He was called King Leonidas. He was king of Sparta at a place called Thermopylae. He led 300 Spartans against an army of thousands. For instance, the Persians who were expanding into the west. So he really fought and defeated them, and he had to sacrifice his own life to protect Greek freedom from the Persian conquest. So, and the legacy he left was, of course, symbol of honor and resistance. And let's go to the next civilization, which is Rome. Rome is where Italy. Oh, wow. Rome was one of the best civilizations that man could ever admire right now, you know. From Italy, then you straight to Europe, then you straight to Africa, across Asia, and Rome is the reason some of us are living today. Rome is the reason we're enjoying this kind of life. Rome is the reason we have these types of government. Rome is the reason we have these types of communication. Rome is the reason we even speak some of our languages. For instance, English. English has 30% Latin. Like Swahili has, I think, 5% Latin. You know what I'm saying? So, Rome. So, the legacy they left, actually, the four main legacies was they introduced law, they introduced military tactics and formations, they introduced engineering, and they introduced good governance. Well, I'm not saying the Romans were good people, but their legacy really has an effect up to today. For example, what made it unique? What do you think made Rome unique? Rome mastered order and control, from roads to the rule of law. It built an empire on discipline, citizenship, and unity. For instance, back in the days, Rome was the first empire to have a multinational people. Like, you could find everyone in the city of Rome, whether black, white, and I think that there was something like Christian, but yeah, it was kind of there, but not that much. Spread Latin culture, law, Christianity across continents. Due to its influence, Rome spread Christianity. I mean, this was a state religion. So that means everyone who was under the Roman Empire was supposed to be Christian. Basically Catholic, not until Sparks came up and split the church. So it actually contributed to the spread of Christianity, and this helped people know more about God. It also gave people a sense of ownership, what I'm saying. Then I want to see one of the most famous figures in Roman history, who was Marcus Aurelius, my famous philosopher. He wrote during Plague and War, wrote Meditations in Solitude. This was a guy who was, despite the fact that he was an emperor, he wasn't satisfied with the way of life he was living. He wasn't satisfied with the way he was treated as emperor. People are dying outside there. People are, facing. People are being enslaved day and night. People are being starved to death. People are being killed like dogs. But then this guy introduced a philosophy which we refer to today as Stoicism. He chose Stoicism and humility over luxury. This guy could have enjoyed everything, but he wrote down and meditated in solitude. He had to sacrifice all his riches and what he had to do everything to. He humbled himself despite the fact he was emperor, and he's considered as one of the best, famous and popular emperors of Rome. And then we have another one, the famous Julius Caesar. This was a guy who defied the Senate. He crossed the Rubicon. He was murdered by his good friends. And these friends feared his power just because they thought, The funny thing is, back then in Rome, whenever you won a war, like you're a general and you won a war, that literally made you, let me put it in present day terms, like in present. For example, we have a parliament in Uganda, and we have a general who leads the army. So you win a war, and you're the general in that war. So basically, from that war, you're made the head of the Senate, because all heads of Senate were soldiers. So what made Caesar wanted to, he kind of conquered the consulate. Let me call it the consulate. So Caesar does this. After the war, he comes back from war, and he has gotten all support from the Romans. All the Romans love him. They're asking him to be the emperor, blah blah blah, but which wasn't part of the contract. So then his friends, including Brutus, who was his, I think, nephew or adopted son, conspired against him, and they killed him. But then his death didn't lead to led the rise of an empire, but it cost the republic. Because surprisingly, all those friends, all those who killed him, later faced unfaithful deaths. So this guy was willing to conquer an empire for Rome. He didn't want to be like a Roman emperor. Sorry, he wanted to be, this general who conquered all states. Let me say, maybe he wanted to be an emperor, but then we didn't see it on the outside. But then on the outside, we saw he wanted Rome to have territories around Europe and around the world. He wanted Rome to be seen as Rome. So that's when his works are what sacrificed and what led to what we are into now, to what life we are living. Because, for instance, when the Romans conquered the Gauls, present-day France, and of course, they introduced all their culture. They introduced everything in how can I say it, in the Gaul land, maybe in French, among the Franks and what. So then that culture was adopted by the French. And later on, mixed up with the French culture. At the end, colonialism, blah, blah, they also introduced their culture in Africa. So that's what I'm saying, that Rome has had a big impact. Lastly, Rome was, I think, the first empire that introduced diplomacy through the formation of the Senate. Like, they believe that not all conflicts are fought by wars. All conflicts can also be, some conflicts can be fought by, let me say, by a Cold War or by peace talks. You know, you can't, not every conflict has to be gunfire and what. So that's what they believed in. Well, second, lastly, we shall talk about the Axumite Empire. Our own here in Ethiopia. This was an African empire, and the reason it's part of the great civilizations of all time, the Axumite Empire introduced it. Actually, that was the first African empire to adopt Christianity. The first, the Axumites were the first Africans to have or to adopt Christianity. So, what made it unique? Why do you think this empire? That's actually, I don't believe really many of you know about this empire. It was controlled. It controlled at the Red Sea between Africa, Arabia, and India, and built monumental, like they call like obelisks from single stones. These obelisks were tall monumental structures that maybe were built in memory of their gods, maybe in memory of their kings, maybe in memory of their, fallen soldiers. So one of the key figures in this empire was King Ezana. This was the first Christian African king, and he converted all his youth, all his people, to a Christian slave tutor called Frumentius. Frumentius was Roman. Yeah, so he introduced Christianity in let me say Ethiopia and Israel. That's why the Ethiopian church is not the same as these other churches we follow in other parts of Africa. They've got this thing of culture into their church. Their church is way different from our churches. You know what I'm saying? So that's why it was the first African kingdom of Christianity. And secondly, this empire received Christianity centuries before Europe received Christianity. So that's why they've got a way different Christian values. They've got a way different. They've got way different practices, different attires to wear during their days of worship, different churches, different attributes to God, all that. So that's the reason. And then another person was Frumentius, who became a bishop. He was the first bishop in Ethiopia, and still spread Christianity, despite the fact that he stayed behind a foreign land to spread peace and faith. The last civilization we are talking about is ancient China. The reason you see Chinese are growing rapidly right now, it's not because this is the first time they have grown. No, it's that they have been growing ever since the beginning of time, ever since then. But then, what made it unique? They built on a figure piety and social harmony. They developed the mandate of heaven. This was the first civilization that introduced the idea of heaven. I'm not saying it wasn't in other civilizations. They introduced the idea we see of heaven. This is the simple explanation. When you die and you did good, you go to heaven. When you die and you did bad, you go to hell. But then, other religions believed when you die, you go to the afterlife. And then you're judged into the afterlife by the supreme judges. And then, on what you've done, at the weight of your sins, what determines where you go. For example, in ancient Judaism, they believed in over 7 heavens. So it also depended on what good and bad you've done. So that's what I'm saying. These Chinese folks were the first people to introduce the mandate of one heaven. Let me put it that way. But in the other religions, let's say Judaism, Hinduism, many other regions in ancient Egypt, among the Aztecs, they all believed in multiple heavens. They believe that when let's say, a person who killed someone is not the same person who stole from someone. Those are different wrongs. So when the person who killed someone and the person who stole from someone dies, it doesn't mean that they will go to the same destination. But in the Chinese philosophy, they believe that when someone died, the person who stole and the person who killed from someone, they all go to the same destination. And this is whereby it was moral. This introduced a moral legitimacy of rulers, whereby rulers were not wrong. All their emperors were not wrong. So that means all emperors, when they died, they had to go to heaven. I mean, these were the representatives of God. So when you're representative of God, when you die, that means you're not going to heaven. And who really So lastly, what also made it unique? They had a culture of innovation and introspection. For example, they introduced paper, they introduced gunpowder. What I'm saying, gunpowder. Of course, you may ask yourself, why gunpowder when we didn't have guns in those days? Well, this was the use of gunpowder. Gunpowder was used to, actually, it was used as an act of poison, to poison the arrows during war. So this, the mineral they used was later adopted by the Industrial Revolutionists to add it to their bullets, make it gunpowder. Yeah. So it was firstly used in war by the ancient Chinese. Yeah. Then let's see the key figures in this Chinese history. We have Confucius. Confucius was a teacher, philosopher, and moral prophet. He lived through one chaos and he taught virtue, order, duty, and empathy. He believed that even during in war, you have to have that good heart. Not okay. Like despite that, the problems you're facing as a person, despite the problems you're facing as a community, despite the issues you have in life, but when it comes to showing empathy, show it in full. So his philosophies have also impacted mostly in Asia and some parts of Africa. And there's also a last poet called Yuan. This was a patriot poet and minister. Yuan, his king of corruption, was ignored and exiled, and he drowned himself in despair, leading to the Dragon Boat Festival. Yuan, whereby back then all civilizations have one thing in common. There's corruption in all civilizations. You have to know that. Because, for example, right now, I think the best civilization we can say right now maybe is America, the United States. This is a superpower. What we call these superpowers were civilizations. But civilizations, I want to warn you, is not the buildings, it's not the architecture they had, it's not the. No. What makes a civilization unique is the way of life they lived that differed from the rest of the world. In short, these were the minorities in the world. I mean, when the first script was introduced, most civilizations had not yet learned how to write. So that set apart a civilization called Sumeria. The Egyptians mummified their bodies. Some civilizations, when a person died, they were either burnt or they were either buried. But these guys believe that when someone is mummified, you go to heaven and life. And their philosophies is what makes them apart, and their ideas. So that's what makes a civilization. So Q1 is remembered every year through the Dragon Boat Festival. You can make research about it. It's a festival done by the Chinese, and it's it's also characterized by partying, having foods, having different talent shows and different culture festivals. Yeah. Thank you for today's episode. Thank you for listening to today's episode, The Lens, and I wish you enjoyed the episode. Just drop your comments and tell me, and please subscribe my YouTube channel and press that follow button on my TikTok.